Gracious God, we seek your Spirit now and your word. Move through us, move in us. Help us to hear your voice this day. We pray in your Son's name. Amen. For the past month and a half, we have listened to the author of Hebrews make his argument. It's been an argument that at times has seemed complex and endlessly repetitive. The book of Hebrews is not one you want to read if you just want a nice, casual, easy read. It's hard, it's deep, it uses symbols that we don't recognize, ones that they recognize but we just don't. And it takes a lot of massaging and reading and rereading. It's not a fun read, in other words, but we've read it. And the argument that has been made is, as I said, repetitive, but also perhaps pretty simple. Using the most recognized symbol of his day, that is, the priest and their sacrifices and the temple that was, the author has laid out a series of if-then statements. If, he says, mere mortal hands and bodies can attain God's grace even for a little while with imperfect sacrifices, if high priests can come before God who are mortal and sinful and will die, then how much more can Jesus attain for us with perfect sacrifices, the one who is not mortal, the one who is God's own Son? How much more can that high priest give us God's grace and show us God's love? That's the argument. All of Hebrews boils down to that if-then statement. This morning, the text does something similar. As I said before I read it, it repeats the same points. It wraps it up. It's like a big, giant sermon, and this is the conclusion piece, where the sermon is wrapped up in a couple of seconds. The author is wrapping up his letter in just a few sentences, and then gives us one final and utterly important therefore. Therefore, says the writer of Hebrews, because of all of this I've just talked about for 11 chapters, therefore we can trust in the promises of God. That's all of Hebrews. This long, confusing book, full of obscure scripture references that we don't get, and cultural touchstones that are 2,000 years out of date. All the repetitive and overt imagery, the arguing from the least to the greatest, is saying one clear thing. We can trust in the promises of God and in Jesus, who shows us God's love and gives us that promise and goes ahead to prepare the way so we may all be invited into God's presence. That's Hebrews. And that feels to me like good news. This morning, as we prepare to celebrate Thanksgiving this weekend, as we remember this week, during our service, the many ways we have to give thanks to God, I think that good news is worth celebrating and worth resting in. We can trust in the promises of God. When we're facing times of stress, either financial or health-wise, or when something's off in a relationship, we don't know where to turn or what to do. We can trust in the promises of God. When our times seem extraordinarily polarized, when we find it hard to come to the table because of different opinions that can divide us, and when we agree to try and do so anyway because we're one in the body of Christ, well, we can trust in the promises of God. When we face national and international disasters, when we stare down wars and rumors of wars, when there are earthquakes and floods and natural disasters and so much pain, promises of God. Time after time, day after day, year after year, and down through the centuries, we can trust in the promises of God. Because the God we know has shown faithfulness to us in Jesus Christ. Faithfulness to us through our lives, the lives of our ancestors in the faith. Because of that, we can trust for now and forever in the promises of God. But what are those promises? Well, I'm not going to try and give you a comprehensive list, because I want to go home before Thanksgiving on Thursday. But the book of Hebrews, along with reminding us to trust in God's promises, reminds us of a few of those. I want to lift those up as we trust and remember God's promises. For starters, we can trust in God's grace and forgiveness that we see in Jesus Christ. In 6 years here and in 10 years this past Friday of ministry, I've probably never preached on the Jesus prayer. And if you don't know what that is, you can ask me later. I'll tell you all about it. And the reason for that is pretty simple. I think that the Jesus prayer oversimplifies both who we are as people and who God is in relation to us, and that the grace and forgiveness and mercy of God goes deeper and wider than just the Jesus prayer tends to say. That we need better ways to talk about that. But it's right about one thing. We are sinners. We do sin. We fail at living up to what God expects of us and dreams for us. And within that reality, within this reality, we need God's grace. We just do. We need God's mercy and forgiveness. We just do. We need those promises God gives us, that our sinfulness is not the end of our story. And we see that in Jesus. We see that in Jesus' promises of God's grace and mercy, and we should never downplay that promise. Because it's needed, and it's important, and it's one we can trust in. But the book of Hebrews goes even one step further. The book of Hebrews doesn't just promise us the grace of God, the forgiveness of God. It promises us a grace so powerful, a forgiveness so complete, a reconciliation so thorough, that we don't need to feel guilty. We can stand before our God with clear consciences, trusting that God's grace is already at work, already present, that God's mercy has already been in our lives, that we are already forgiven. Because our great high priest has said that it is so. One of the activities I do with my confirmands, we're going to do it next week actually, so Jared, close your ears, is I have them write on a paper cross on the wall things that divide us from God and each other, sins basically. And then I get some post-it notes and have them write things we can do to heal, to make whole, to bring new life to the world, to each other. And those post-it notes go on the paper cross until you can't see the sins anymore, because the promises we make to one another for healing and holding are so thorough that they cover up all of the sins. That's how God's mercy and grace is for us, at least as the book of Hebrews portrays it. It is so thorough that it can't even be seen anymore, because the new life God gives us has totally covered it up. We can trust in the promises of God. Another promise the book of Hebrews offers, and that's that we can stand before God. Now, some of this imagery you have to understand the temple to get, and You might know this, but it's the case. In Jesus' day, when the temple existed, there was a big veil at the back. And that was to separate the temple, even the priests, from the Holy of Holies, the most sacred place where God was most thoroughly said to be. And the high priest could go there only once a year. And after much ritual sacrificing, to offer up the annual rite of forgiveness for all of the people. According to the book of Hebrews, Jesus has removed that curtain and made a way through it for us, the people of God, to come and stand before the throne of grace. There is nothing that separates us from God. We can come to God's presence, so Hebrews tells us, because Jesus has prepared the way, because Jesus is the host, because Jesus has pushed that curtain aside, has removed that veil from us. We can come before our very Creator and be in relationship with our Creator, because the love of God seen in Jesus made it so. Because the curtain is no longer there. God wants to know us just as we are. That's a key part of this passage, a key part of our faith. It's a promise we can trust in as we trust in the promises of God. You might notice, however, that Hebrews doesn't just lay out promises, but also gives us a bit of a call. Gives us some work to do. But interestingly, Hebrews doesn't say to us, go and live good lives, and go and love other people, go and care for the least of these. Other texts do that, but Hebrews doesn't. Hebrews says to us, go and live a life so full of love that you provoke those around you to also love. How powerful is that? Go and live in such a way that others see you and therefore show love and care and do good works. Provoke others by your life to lives that give glory to God. What imagery, what an amazing thing to think about. What does it look like to live in such ways? I think there are some ways we've shown, and more ways we can do beyond that. Do we give to the food pantry in those carts in ways that inspire us all to keep bringing our items? What's the 40 cans of Lent, if not a hopeful inspiration as we give, that we inspire each other to keep bringing things around this altar to fill up the space? What's the Thanksgiving basket out there, if not a reminder to care for those who need our assistance in this holiday season? And then there's prayer. I won't give you the details of people, lest the person doesn't want to speak people to know. I had a member once at a church I was serving who talked to me about their prayer life. This person walked everywhere. They loved to walk. And they talked about when they would walk, and they would pass by a school, they would stop and pray for that school. Or maybe even just keep walking while praying for that school. They prayed for their neighbors as they walked. Pray for businesses as they walked. Pray for the community as they walked. Well, I don't know why that person told me the story. I remember, actually. I probably knew why at the time. But it's been provoking for me. It has helped me to deepen my own prayer life. And I do take walks sometimes, not as much as that person did. When I walk, sometimes I'm with the kids and I'm just focusing on kids. And sometimes I'm wrestling with something and I'm focusing on my own prayer life, trying to figure stuff out. But sometimes I'm just walking for the sake of walking. And in those times, I have now, at least occasionally, because of the example of this member, pray. Lift it up. Schools and the community. and my neighbors. I was provoked into more acts of loving and caring by the life of somebody I met in the church. We can all do that kind of provoking for each other and for the world as we trust in the promises of God. Trust in the promises, Hebrews says. That's the message. That's the point. Not just of Hebrews, but of our faith. It is what faith means, is to trust. To trust in God. To trust in God's goodness and faithfulness. And on this Thanksgiving week, be grateful for promises that are trustworthy